Want to know how to use this for sewing? Come along with me today as I visit the hardware store and pick up 10 sewing tools that you probably didn't know you could buy at the hardware store, often for less money. The first tool that you can get at the hardware store is a rubber mallet. So a rubber mallet is something that you'll use for setting snaps, for putting in eyelets, for putting in grommets. And the reason you want to use a rubber mallet is that it provides a firm strike, but it's soft enough that it's not going to damage your material. So it's not going to damage the metal of your grommet or your eyelet or your snap. And when you're using this, you want to make sure to use it on a hard surface. So something like concrete, you probably don't want to do it on a table that's going to break, just something really firm and really hard. You can also use a soft tip hammer. That's another option. It's a little bit more hammer shaped, but I prefer a rubber mallet personally. Speaking of eyelets and grommets, did you know that you can find those at the hardware store as well? So I found this grommet kit. It's got 1/2 inch and 3/8 inch grommets in it. And it also has all the tools that you need for setting the grommets. And it was really inexpensive. You can also find snaps at the hardware store. I did not know that. I saw snaps there. I saw eyelets of all different sizes, and they're very, very cheap. So if you have a project that's going to use grommets or eyelets, that's something that you can get at the hardware store, or you can just pick them up the next time you're there to have them on hand in your sewing room. Next up, something you might not think of buying at the hardware store that you can use in sewing are strips of Velcro. So strips of Velcro are something that you can use in bag making or when you're sewing children's wear. And you can find them in rolls, you can find them in pre-cut strips, you can even find them in little circles, which are great for bag making. Sometimes it even comes with an adhesive backing, and that means you don't have to pin it in place. You can just adhere it right onto your fabric and stitch over it. All right, next up, magnets. You can buy magnets at the hardware store and you can use those to glue onto the bottom of a bowl and make your own little magnetic pin dish, or you can actually find magnetic bowls at the hardware store. So these are made for small parts, for screws and things like that, but they work great for pins and they're really, really cheap. So I actually have these scattered all over my sewing room, so I can just toss pins in them whenever I'm sewing, and they're always accessible to me. So this is a really affordable thing that you can pick up, and I personally love magnetic pin cushions, but these are much cheaper than the ones you can get at the fabric store. Masking tape or painter's tape is also something that's really useful to have around your sewing room. One thing you can use it for is to mark seam allowances on your sewing machine. So if you have a wide seam allowance that goes beyond the markings, you can just mark them with a piece of painter's tape. Another thing you can use it for is to temporarily hold fabric in place without leaving any kind of residue. So for example, if you're putting in a zipper and you want to hold it in place, or if you're putting in a patch pocket and you want to hold it down, painter's tape can work for that really, really well. Another thing you can use it for is for marking the right and the wrong side of your fabric. So if you have a fabric where it's kind of hard to tell what's the right side and what's the wrong side, you can use painter's tape to mark that. I also often use it to mark pattern pieces. So I'll just put a piece of painter's tape on my piece after it's cut out and mark which piece it is. You can also take a lesson from quilters and use it to mark basically seam guides right on your fabric. So you can lay a piece of painter's tape and then stitch right along it so you have a really precise line. Next up are these big metal washers, which are my favorite to use for pattern weights. They're heavy enough to hold down your fabric, to hold down the pattern paper, but they're lightweight enough that you can move them around your space really easily, reposition things, and they're just really handy to have around. You can space them out around your pattern piece in whatever way you like. They're also really easy to grab and store nested in a little container. I just wouldn't recommend putting them on your finger. Got it. You can also store them on a pegboard, which we're gonna get to in a minute. Next up are clamps. So I have 2 types of clamps here. This is a C-clamp, and we also have, this is called a spring clamp. So you can actually use clamps to hold your fabric in place, but one way that I really like to use them is to hold my cutting mat on my table so it doesn't slide around. I prefer C-clamps for that. I just think they're a lot more adjustable and they work better for a thick tabletop, but if you have a smaller tabletop, a spring clamp might work. Next is one of my personal favorites, which is pegboard. So if you mount some pegboard on your wall, you'll have a great place to store almost all of your sewing tools and notions. You can use it to organize your tools, organize your project plans, and get everything out of drawers, off of your table surfaces, and use up that vertical space in whatever space you have. There are so many different cool pegboard accessories that you can buy, from regular pegs to hooks. There's all kinds of stuff you can attach. You could create a sewing queue and move your projects along on a timeline from start to finish, all on your pegboard. You can also use it to mount lighting if you don't have a lot of overhead light in your sewing space. And speaking of lighting, that is something you can also find at the hardware store for really cheap. One thing you can find at the hardware store are LED strips, which you can mount on your pegboard or mount on your shelves. You can also find work lights like this one that clamp to desks, or they clamp to shelves. I actually used to buy these for printmaking back in the day, and they're really handy, they're really cheap. You can put any bulb you want in there, so if you want a super bright light, these are a really, really great choice. And you can put them anywhere. You can clamp them anywhere you want them. So wherever you need a little extra task lighting, if you have a dark corner of your sewing space that needs a little bit more lighting, these cheap shop lights will help you out. Another thing you can find at the hardware store are headlamps, which you might not think to use for sewing, but if you're sewing black fabric at night, it can come in handy for sure. All right, next is something you might not have heard of before, which is heat shrink tubing. You can use heat shrink tubing to finish the ends of cords and drawstrings. You slide the tubing over the end and then you apply heat and it shrinks to provide a nice professional finish, and it prevents fraying. It also makes it way easier to thread that drawstring through. No bodkin or safety pin needed. You can find this in the hardware store with the electrical supplies. These 10 tools that I found at the hardware store are all super useful, but also super affordable. And I have one more bonus thing I found that I think will come in handy. I found these huge canvas drop cloths at the hardware store, so I picked it up to show you guys. This is a really nice, sturdy canvas, and because it comes in these huge sizes, it's really, really inexpensive. It'd be great to use these for bags or even for curtains if you need a lot of yardage. You can also dye them, you can print them, and you can even paint them. So we use one here in our studio that we've dyed, and we use it all the time in our photo shoots. You could also use it as a heavyweight muslin. So if you're making pants, for example, and you need a bottom weight option, it's a really good choice. It's kind of like getting a bed sheet at the thrift store, but for pants. And if you want more ideas for tools you can use without spending a lot of money, you might check out this video that's all about sewing tools that are under $10. So I'll see you over there.